Hi, my name is Amy Zhang, and I'm presenting this work in collaboration with Grant Hugh and Michael Bernstein. To begin, I'd like you to consider the tools you use to participate in online communities, tools like Slack, mailing lists, Facebook groups, or Reddit. Now, I want you to think about how these groups are governed. What is the process by which actions in the community get approved and happen? The answer to this question is strikingly similar from platform to platform. Almost all of these platforms involve some sort of model involving administrators or admins, moderators or mods, and regular users, where if you're an admin or a mod, you have the ability to govern others, but if you're a regular user, you can't. An admin mod model is an example of a permissions model. The way a permissions model works is whenever a user wants to do something, like ban another user from the community, the system first checks the permissions table to see whether the user has a permission to do that thing. If so, then the action is approved. Certain sets of permissions get bundled together into roles, such as an admin role or a mod role, like I mentioned. So while a typical mod can carry out governance actions like moderating content or adding or removing a user, something like an admin role would have the permission to modify the governance itself, such as changing the permissions table to give a user mod powers. Meanwhile, regular users have no say in the governance of their community. This roles and permissions model is really everywhere when you think about it, including in most collaborative software that we use every day, even down to the access control for files in UNIX-like operating systems. But a permissions model can only describe a limited set of possible governance options. For the most part, it's top-down, autocratic, and punitive. But looking around at our different offline communities and our different offline governments, there are actually a lot of other styles of governance that exist. And maybe some of these styles more closely embody the values of a community. So if a community wants to have a different style of governance, say a more democratic style of governance, they have one of two options. So either they can carry it out manually in an ad hoc way, which can be cumbersome and error-prone. And we can see some examples of this in different online communities. For instance, some Reddit communities actually hold elections for mods. Or they can use or build one-off software tools for doing things like taking a poll or carrying out a particular rule. For instance, on Wikipedia, there are lots of these one-off bots that carry out certain procedures, such as closing a debate after a certain period of time has passed. These can be pretty hard to maintain because each tool only addresses only one small portion of governance, and thus it can be hard to get all these different tools to be working together. At the end of the day, because these underlying software that these online communities are using already have embedded a certain style of governance into the code itself, it takes a lot of effort to work around that. So despite, for instance, in English Wikipedia, there are these different deliberative democratic practices, the media wiki software upon which English Wikipedia relies still operates using a basic roles and permissions model, requiring the use of things like manual work and bots. So instead, our project asked, what if we didn't start from a roles and permissions based model for governance and instead allowed communities to actually build for themselves the style of governance that actually suits their own community's needs and values? So to enable this, we built PolicyKit. PolicyKit is a software infrastructure that empowers the members of an online community to concisely author a wide range of governance procedures and also automatically carry out those procedures on their home platforms. So PolicyKit's main insight is to shift governance from articulating permissions to articulating procedures, where procedures can express a wide range of governance models concisely, including participatory ones and democratic models. To explain how that works, so when a user wants to do something, like ban another user from the community, instead of checking a permissions table, we instead go to the policies that govern that action. So policies are short scripts written in code describing the procedure for carrying out an action. In this case, this policy says that for this particular action to happen, it first must be approved by a majority of community members. This is a script that's continually running and checking against any actions that come in. If the policy then returns that that action can run, that is, a majority of community members have approved the action, then the action will actually be carried out. In addition, this process is also how modification of the existing governance can happen. allowing community members to actually participate in the governance of not only everyday actions, but also in the evolution of governance over time. So for instance, a user can suggest that the policy for banning accounts should be changed. There's also going to be a policy there written for governing changes to existing policies. So then we run that script, and if it passes, then this user's new policy would get put into place. So within our data model, we differentiate these two different types of policies as platform policies, or policies governing everyday actions that happen on a community platform, and constitution policies, or policies that cover actions that modify the governance itself. And these are terms taking inspiration from political science theory developed by Elinor Ostrom. So here are some examples. So we've mentioned actions as these one-off events that users can propose, and we've also mentioned policies, or these long-running scripts that are checking actions as they come up. So an example of a platform action would be, Sarah would like to post the message hi to the announcements channel on Slack. A platform policy governing that action would be, any post to the announcements channel must first be approved by a moderator. An example of a constitution action then would be, Jane would like to introduce a new policy for renaming channels. A constitution policy would be that to add any new policy, it first must be voted in by a majority vote. These are the components of PolicyKit to make it work. So PolicyKit consists of a series of platform integration libraries, one for each platform that PolicyKit can work with. So far, we've written libraries for Slack, Reddit, and Discord. It also, and the integration libraries do things like listen for actions that happen on a platform that need to be governed. They also execute any actions that have passed back on that platform. PolicyKit also has a policy engine. This is a long-running process that takes in actions that are proposed and checks them against existing policies, as I mentioned. Finally, we have a PolicyKit website, and on that website, we have a user interface for users to propose constitution actions. And we also have a code editor for users to actually author policies. So now I'll explain how to write policies using an example of a policy that creates a random jury of members to vote on renaming Slack channels. So writing a policy involves implementing 6 functions. The first function is filter. In this function, the policy selects what actions it governs. In this case, we only want to govern actions for renaming Slack channels. Then in the initialize function, we set up anything we need to get the policy going. So in this case, we need to set up a random jury of 3 community members to vote on this rename. Then in the notify function, we now notify any users on the platform about this action and solicit votes. So in this case, we notify the jury members about what they're voting on, and we give them instructions. Next, we have the check function. So here we set the conditions for whether an action can actually pass. For the jury case, we've specified that if 2 or more jury members have voted yes, then it passes. We also set a time limit of 2 days for the voting period. Otherwise, actions could be in a limbo state indefinitely if jury members don't vote. Finally, we have the 2 functions of pass and fail. Here, we just specify what code should run if the action passes and what should run if the action fails. In the jury case, if it passes, we just want to execute the action of renaming the channel, which takes care of the implementation of that on the platform side. So I've already mentioned that PolicyKit involves this platform integration library for automatically carrying out governance on a platform of choice. Now I'll explain in more detail how PolicyKit does this and the necessary work to implement a platform integration. So working through the entire process, first, say a user tries to rename a channel on Slack using the Slack interface. Our Slack platform integration in PolicyKit includes a listener that is listening to all governable actions. It catches the action and then passes it along to the policy engine. From there, the engine runs all relevant policies on the action, including the jury policy for channel renames. We go through each function step by step, starting with filter, then we initialize the jury. Next, we run check, which at this point doesn't pass or fail since there aren't any votes yet and the time limit hasn't been reached. At this point, PolicyKit goes and actually reverts the rename action on the platform, since we haven't determined yet whether or not it can actually happen. Next, we run the notify function, which then sends messages to the jury members telling them to vote. In our Slack integration library, we capture votes by listening for a thumbs up or a thumbs down emoji reaction to the notify message. And different platform integrations can come up with different ways of capturing votes. After a jury member has voted, our vote listener catches the vote and stores it in the PolicyKit database. Meanwhile, the jury policy is still looping and running check periodically to see whether all the votes are in. Once votes are in and say the policy passes, we then run the pass function, which then actually goes and renames the channel on Slack again. So the code that users are writing in the policies is Python. And as can be seen, we provide some functions for policy authors as part of our PolicyKit API. So there are more details in the paper, and we also have some API documentation. But one example of something that we do provide is a JSON blob associated with each action and policy to allow policy authors to be able to store and retrieve data. So as an example, in the jury case, we stored information about the jury members for each action. I'll also briefly mention some extensions to the basic data model that we provide. All of these are implementable using our existing structure of actions and policies, but we introduce these extensions on top of that in order to make it easier to do certain things that are common in a lot of communities. So as one example, we introduce a roles and permissions system that users can use in addition to policies. So for instance, you could define a policy for elections to appoint the next president of a community, but while that person has the president role, they might have certain permissions on certain actions that override any policies regarding those actions. We also introduced the concept of text documents to allow people to author natural language policies like community guidelines. The editing of these documents is also governed by PolicyKit. Next, we have this concept of action bundles as well as policy bundles, which are basically just sets of actions and sets of policies. These are useful in the case of, for instance, action bundles. We need things like elections, where you aren't just deciding on one action and whether that passes or fails, but you're making a choice between several potential actions. Policy bundles are useful for these multi-stage policies. So for instance, in a number of offline governments, sometimes before a law can pass, it first must be approved in one body of elected representatives, then there's a vote in another, and then maybe there's a final approval by a president, et cetera, et cetera. These are all examples that we show in the paper as well. So for the PolicyKit website, here is kind of the first version of the site that we have up right now, where users can propose actions, they can author policies in a code editor, and they can also see the existing governance of the community, including all the existing roles and permissions, the existing policies that are there, text documents that the community has written up together. We're now working on building a new version of this interface and improving the policy editing experience for both programmers and non-programmers. We eventually want to make the system usable for non-programmers. And we've also done things like we've launched starter kits to allow kind of one-click import for these well-known governance setups like juries and elections. We also are providing templates for people to be able to import and be able to even share policies with each other. So far we've built platform integrations with Slack, Reddit, and Discord, as I mentioned, and we also plan to add additional platforms. You can learn more about PolicyKit. You may be able to add it to your community soon at policykit.org. We have all of our code open sourced, and that's it. Thank you.